So the focus of your podcast, and I love the word courageous applied to the choices we make. It requires a certain kind of courage in our culture to be able to say we're lonely. But I can just assure people, because I talked about my own loneliness in the book, as soon as you can muster that courage and get it out there, I can share my experience, but I've also heard from many people, it's a game changer. Because since we're all lonely from time to time, it actually unites you with the human narrative. And as I said, I think being lonely, the sense that we need human connection from time to time, is one of the most human of feelings. And it's not a disease, it's not an illness, and it's certainly not something that you should view as your fault.
Welcome to The Courage Effect. I'm Suzanne Weller, and this is a show about growth and unleashing what's possible. You will hear inspiring stories about what courage looks like, how we navigate what's getting in our way, and the opportunities that surface when we choose courage over comfort. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to The Courage Effect. This is Suzanne. I'm thrilled to have you here today. So our topic today is loneliness. It is a heavy topic, and I think it's one, I know it's one that we have all experienced in different ways in our lives. And, we as human beings really are wired for connection, and we live in a world that is sadly almost breeding disconnection. We know that we've arrived at a crisis of loneliness. We know that, this research has been well documented. We're seeing that this is particularly showing up with younger adults, ages 18 to 24, and also with older adults, ages 65 and plus. And I would love to have a conversation today with Dr. Jeremy Nobel to talk about loneliness. How can we get more comfortable in acknowledging it, in expressing it ourselves, and just bringing the conversation to light? And what are the things that we can do to hopefully relieve it and prevent it moving forward? So let me give you some background on Dr. Nobel. He is a primary care physician, public health practitioner, and award-winning poet with faculty appointments at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the Harvard Medical School. He's the founder and president of the Foundation for Art and Healing, whose signature initiative, Project Unlonely, addresses the personal and public health challenges of loneliness and social isolation, which has gained national visibility, as has his book, which was published last year, Project Unlonely, Healing Our Crisis of Disconnection. Dr. Nobel, welcome to The Courage Effect.
Thanks, Suzanne. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you for being here. So as I said before, we all experience loneliness, and it is something that there's quite a bit of stigma around. And one of the things that I really loved about your book was having a better idea of what different types of loneliness there are. So can you talk to us a little bit about what you call loneliness literacy?
Yes. So thanks, and I appreciate the kind words on my book. And I wrote the book, before we jump in, really to humanize and demystify loneliness. So exactly what we're going to do with our time together today, but also offer people some basic principles so they could learn to navigate loneliness in their own lives, as well as introduce some things that many people feel surprising that can connect us. And I'm sure we'll get to that today. I think the most important thing for people to just begin to understand about loneliness is it's not the same as being alone. There's still a lot of confusion for that, in part because during the pandemic, of course, many of us were alone and then also experienced loneliness as a result of being alone. But they're not the same thing. Being alone is just the absence of social contact. That could be, you're living alone or you're in a rural area and so on, and you just simply don't come in touch with other people. Now, sometimes that does introduce loneliness, and loneliness is defined as the gap between the social connections we'd like to have, what we aspire to, what we sometimes even dream about, and what we actually feel we experience. As such, it's completely subjective as opposed to being alone, which is objective. But you can understand people's confusion because often being alone objectively makes us feel lonely. But if we look at our own experience, I think many people relate to being lonely in a crowd. So just being around other people is no guarantee that you won't be lonely.
I really appreciate you calling out that differentiation because and this also, I think of my husband and I, like we
Yeah.
both like our alone time. He likes his alone time. Well, he needs more of it than I do. There's no one recipe for what that is. And I still thrive in my alone time and I need it. So I appreciate you calling out that being alone doesn't necessarily mean that you are lonely.
Absolutely. In fact, being alone can be such a positive experience. We have a fancy word for it. We call it solitude sometimes.
Well said.
Yeah. But Suzanne, you asked about types of loneliness. And I'll have to say, of all the things that I learned in the 10 years or so that I've really been digging into loneliness, realizing that since loneliness is a mood or an emotion, very much like love, and there are many kinds of love, it shouldn't surprise us that there are different kinds of loneliness. And through our work at the Foundation for Art and Healing and Project Unlonely, we've identified three kinds of loneliness that I think it's useful for people to know about. The first is psychological loneliness. Do I have someone I can connect with? The second is societal loneliness. Do I feel I fit into society, or am I being systematically excluded because of race or gender or disability? And the third, in some ways the most intriguing, is a kind of spiritual or existential loneliness. How do I fit into the human story? What was here before I arrived? What will be here after I depart? Does my life have meaning, purpose, and consequence? So those are the three types. And as you could imagine, you could have one, two, three, or none of those types. But what I also want to emphasize is loneliness, the feeling we need human connection, is in some ways the most human of our emotions. And we're all lonely from time to time. That's nothing to be concerned or fearful of. We just need to recognize it and keep it from spiraling into severe, chronic, and sustained loneliness, which is quite toxic, both mentally and physically.
I appreciate you calling that out. And the one question that I have for you is that, when I'm feeling lonely, it's like, what is this telling me?
I love that framing. In fact, Suzanne, that's something I urge in the book, which is not treat loneliness as your fault or that you're defective or flawed, which many people do. They think that, being lonely is because they're defective in some way. Otherwise, they'd have an abundance of exactly the kind of connections they want. But just as you say, to imagine loneliness as a signal, there's something you need. Just like thirst is a signal we need hydration, loneliness is a signal that we all need some degree of human connection, which, by the way, includes connection to ourselves.
Yes. Well, and it's also, I think people are just so afraid to admit it, right? I mean, because when we reach out, it's like, oh, I wanted to say hi, or I wanted to have a conversation. I think it's rare that we say, I'm reaching out because I'm lonely.
Well, it's so the focus of your podcast, and I love the word courageous applied to the choices we make. It requires a certain kind of courage in our culture to be able to say we're lonely. But I can just assure people, because I've talked about my own loneliness in the book, as soon as you can muster that courage and get it out there, I can share my experience, but I've also heard from many people, it's a game changer. It begins because since we're all lonely from time to time, it actually unites you with the human narrative.
Yeah.
And as I said, I think being lonely, the sense that we need human connection from time to time, is one of the most human of feelings. And it's not a disease, it's not an illness, and it's certainly not something that you should view as your fault.
And how do we start to get to that point of like diagnosing our loneliness for I don't know if diagnosing is the word that you would use, but that's just what I'm putting out there.
Yeah, no, we're starting to, and I think there's, understanding. We can understand why that is. We're kind of medicalizing loneliness a little bit. We're using words like diagnosing. I'm not picking on that word, but also epidemic and so on. Mm-hmm. My only concern with it, what I do like about it, is it raises it in our consciousness, right, to bigger levels of more sustained attention, right, when, it obviously is stigmatized to a certain degree. But here's the risk, which is if we medicalize it and let's use a fancy word, pathologize loneliness, people who struggle with loneliness are prone to saying, well, here's something else that I'm just terrible at. I'm not even, I've got this other problem, rather than, as you said, Suzanne, view it as a signal. I know very few people who are embarrassed about being thirsty. Why are we embarrassed about being lonely? And here's the good news. It's a cultural kind of construction. In our culture, we've been trained, or, we get cues and signals that we're supposed to feel a little ashamed of being lonely. And the good news is anything that's culturally created can get culturally recreated. And that's the power of your show and these messages, to really just begin to understand loneliness, demystify it, and humanize it.
I love that. And it is demystifying it. I think that it's just a matter of getting to that point of as you said, what's it telling me? And then figuring out, okay, where do I go from there? And I'm also really struck by, how we ask people questions to know when they're lonely or not. Are there any from your point of view, how do you broach that with somebody?
A lot of it depends on the kind of relationship you have with them, of course. When I have to say that there's room for it in more conversations now than there used to be. Because imagine, now that we've all gone through this shared 4 years of certainly more isolation, and for many people, more loneliness, it's now less threatening to have a conversation that begins something like, I was always lonely from time to time, and then the pandemic really, accentuated that. I'm wondering how it was for you. A simple, open-ended question that people can navigate at whatever comfort level they have. But just asking the question destigmatizes it. Just saying the word out loud destigmatizes it. So that's how we can be helpful. And many people, when you invite them to have those conversations, they're cautious about it because they're still struggling with, okay, should I be guilty about this, or did I do something wrong? But I think more and more people feel comfortable responding. So we're moving in the right direction.
Well, maybe that's one of the gifts of the pandemic.
I think it is one of the silver linings, for sure. The other silver lining is, it just, for many of us, as we talked about, being on your own can be quite positive. This is solitude, as you talked about. And I can just share from my experience. I got off the rat race of being on planes 3 days a week and one talk or project after another, and settling down in place, because I had the same kind of isolation requirements that everyone else did, kind of gave me more time to think through what was important to me, how I wanted to prioritize my time, that I wanted to value friendships more, and I started investing in those, even people I hadn't seen for a while. And yes, Zoom's not perfect, but it's a lot of fun reconnecting with college classmates, med school classmates, just saying, wow, these are strange times. How have you been?
And it does really sort of give us that opportunity. As you said, it can actually be seen as a springboard. So, and how do we do that in a way that's creative? And that is one of the things that I want to talk about in the second half of the show. We are going to take a break in a minute. Is the arts, and really how do we use arts and creativity as something to be able to connect with people in a new way, and hopefully, as you said too, connect with ourselves, because I do feel like a lot of the isolation that we experience is not necessarily knowing ourselves and getting into that more existential zone of who am I now? So yeah, just small questions.
Wonderful small questions, but they really take us on a journey that could be quite exciting, quite rewarding, but it does take some courage.
Definitely. All right, let's take a quick break. When we come back, I'd love to talk a little bit more about the arts and creativity, and how do we potentially stop that spiral from happening, or recognize when we might be slipping into it. So
that sounds great.
Great. You're listening to The Courage Effect. Stay tuned. Courage takes on many forms. I know from personal experience that one of the most courageous things we can do is to recognize when we need help and seek out support. If you're going through a hard time, feeling like something is interfering with your happiness or the ability to achieve your goals, therapy can give you tools to approach your life in a very different way. And that's why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, BetterHelp. BetterHelp's mission is to make therapy more affordable and accessible. It's an online platform where you can be matched with a professional therapist in as little as a few days. For more information and to get matched with a therapist, go to betterhelp.com That's HELP.com/courage. Visiting this link both supports the show and gets you 10% off your first month of BetterHelp. So if you're struggling, consider online therapy with BetterHelp.
Easy on the ears, good for the soul. Alternative Talk 1150.
Welcome back to The Courage Effect. This is Suzanne, and I am in conversation with Dr. Jeremy Nobel. So we've been talking about loneliness, and I'm curious when we talk about this as far as when we recognize that we're sitting in it, and when is it healthy loneliness or just, like something that we're experiencing on a more regular basis versus when it becomes worrisome or problematic. Can you talk to us a little bit about what are those warning signs that we should be paying attention to?
Absolutely. It's so helpful for everyone to know, not just for their own self-care, but to keep an eye on people they care about, neighbors, friends, and so on. So as I mentioned, Suzanne, everyone is lonely from time to time. It's a very normal, very human feeling. When should we worry about it? Right? We know that unchecked, when it really becomes chronic and severe, loneliness can be a major mental health, physical health risk. But day to day, occasional twinges of loneliness are not a problem. Here's what to pay attention to. If you start finding that you're becoming much more anxious, that you're kind of on edge, that you might have sleep disturbances, that's a very general kind of set of signals. It could be other things besides loneliness, but don't overlook loneliness as a cause. And ask yourself, of the three types of loneliness, right, where I'm feeling there's no one I can turn to share my story with and feel connected, or that, I'm just feeling more and more systematically excluded, since I told my family and friends, since I came out, for instance, right? Or, since I had an injury that makes me disabled and, systematically excluded. Or you're worrying about the world and the future in some very troublesome ways. So if you find that your anxiety and your feeling ill at ease is accompanied by these other thoughts of loneliness, that is a signal that you might want to pay more attention to the social connections and deliberately cultivating them. To connect with people you may not have talked to for a while, or take advantage of anything from a book club at the local library or something that puts you in connection with others and just enables that beautiful human connection to unfold.
Yeah. Now,
some people say, well, but if I knew how to do that, I wouldn't be lonely. And that's right. But here is in a way, maybe approach it again with that curiosity, to be playful a little bit and saying, I've always loved going on walks in nature. Why don't I find a group to go out on a walk with? Share something with people that you feel an authentic connection to. Sometimes it's volunteering. Sometimes it's getting involved in some kind of service work in your community. So there are a variety of things. And the reason that's so important is as we start to get lonely, our brains start to change. We start seeing the world as risky. And of course, most people know from their own experience, when they're lonely, their first thought isn't, why don't I just jump in and spend more time with other people? It's an unpleasant feeling. You tend to back away. When you back away, what happens? You get lonelier. And then people start noticing, because you're a little lonely, people are often hesitant. They're not the first to smile. They're not the first to reach out and connect with people. And then other people say, well, I guess Jeremy wants to be alone, or wants to, be off by himself. And they start to leave you alone. As a result, what happens? You become even lonelier. So as then you get even lonelier, this is a phenomenon called spiraling. Sometimes people start altering their behaviors. They start looking a little less friendly, even hostile, because they're afraid of human connection at this point. They're fearful that they might have their feelings hurt or whatever. So other people see that, and then they certainly back away, and then you become lonelier. So rinse and repeat. This is the loneliness spiral. And that's exactly what we should all be aware of, not just in ourselves, but the people we care about.
And how does that work with societal loneliness? Because if you're somebody that really can potentially feel lonely when you're in the midst of a crowd, is there a risk of exacerbating it as you start to insert? I mean, I'm just wondering if you're somebody that is feeling like the outsider and you don't really have that peer group, or you're just feeling like you're not a part of it. Is there a risk of diving in?
Well, okay, so feeling lonely in a crowd can have multiple types of loneliness associated with it. It could be, for instance, I feel lonely in a crowd because I know everyone is looking at me, because now I'll make something up. Now I've lost my hair, and so they don't like people who don't have hair, and so they're just excluding me. They're not as friendly as they used to be when I had a full head of hair. I'm just making this up to be a little fanciful. It could be anything you're excluded about. So that is societal loneliness, where you feel systematically excluded. But another reason people could feel lonely in a crowd is they say, I'm just not a great person. I've been wasting my life. I haven't been doing things that are worthwhile. My life doesn't have meaning and purpose. Why should anyone want to be my friend? And I don't really want to, I don't think I can relate to the people in this room. That's different than being systematically excluded because of race or gender. That's a kind of existential or spiritual loneliness where people literally don't feel the confidence or the self-worth that they can actually connect with others in a meaningful way. So just being lonely in a crowd doesn't necessarily mean you're being excluded by that crowd, is my point here. But in either case, if you do start feeling increased sense of loneliness, you might start by asking yourself, can I figure out what kind of loneliness I have? Is it because I don't have a friend to confide in? Or is it because I feel systematically excluded? Or I'm very confused about meaning and purpose? The reason it's useful to identify the type of loneliness is because what you would do to address it is actually different. If the problem is, I just don't have friends I can have an authentic conversation with, you can get involved in activities you care about that puts you in touch with those friends. If you potential friends, things you really, that are meaningful to you are likely to be meaningful to the other people doing them, and becomes a natural opportunity for, what often start as simple conversations, not your deepest disclosures, but just, wow, it's great to see you today here at this book club talking about, right, whatever it is. But then it lays the foundation that you can then risk slightly more disclosure. So I'll come back to courage as a theme again. One of the things that's absolutely critical and sometimes hard to do in making authentic connections is to give people something authentic about yourself to connect with. And so you have to tolerate the discomfort of that disclosure. And that takes courage. Because then you're thinking, well, if they knew that I was born in such and such a country, maybe they hate people from that country. And yet it's very important for your identity. So you want to share it. It's important. And it just goes, right down the line in terms of needing courage to be willing to risk disclosing so people can see you for who you are and connect with you on a human and authentic level.
And sitting in vulnerability too is one of the things that I'm hearing, which obviously goes hand in hand with courage.
No, absolutely. And I think, Brene Brown has done a great job really in clarifying and humanizing vulnerability. I don't want to even imagine I'm at her level of being such a powerful educator and model, but it's very similar. To be able to acknowledge vulnerability requires similar courage to acknowledging loneliness.
Yeah. And where do the arts come in? Talk to us a little bit about that.
I am so glad you asked that. I have to say that, I always loved and, enjoyed the arts, but it wasn't until we started work with arts as an intervention after 9/11, it was for trauma, not loneliness. We started with trauma and I began to really see the power of the arts to change our brains, our minds, and our behaviors. So real quick, arts in the brain. First of all, a lot more is known now than when we started, right? The arts reduce levels of the stress hormone cortisol. They increase levels of dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, endorphins, the so-called feel-good hormones. So if you do the arts, at the very least, you're calmer and you're in a good mood. That's not a bad way to connect with people. But the arts also change how you make sense of the world. Things that are threatening look less threatening. They look inviting, and it opens the door to empathy and compassion and other very important mind states, psychological states for connection. So the arts also change your mind. And then with this open-mindedness, often based on kind of the stories that the arts share, whether it's dance, music, poetry, you're willing to share your own story. And so it actually changes your behavior. So it changes your brain, you're calmer, you're less threatened by the world. It changes your mind, where you're psychologically more eager and willing to connect, enthusiastic about those connections. And then ultimately you do those behaviors, and that's what connects you.
I love it. And I love the whole idea of like rewiring your brain a little bit and paying attention to, I mean, what I'm hearing is noticing when you're feeling these things, diving in a bit deeper to investigate where it's coming from, and then starting to experiment and try new things to not only just connect with people, but to potentially use your brain differently.
And real quick, just to kind of wrap up this thought, remember that negative spiral?
Yeah.
The arts and creativity and imagination can create a positive spiral. So as you get more optimistic about the world, you see more connection, you feel more part of the bigger human story. You can be bolder, you can take more risks, you can, say hello to people you otherwise would pass by on the streets and be surprised at how warm their welcoming smiles and comments are, and you become more connected as opposed to more disconnected.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that the last chapter of your book is called The Call to Connect, because that really is what all of this is. The courage to to connect.
And it does take courage for sure. And what I tell people is just remember, like other human courageous acts, you're not alone in doing it. It feels like you're alone sometimes. That's kind of the trick our brains, kind of play on us, but you're not alone. We're all eager to connect.
Yes. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what brought you to research and to study loneliness and to dedicate so much of your work towards it.
It's been growing over the years, Suzanne. When you see patients in primary care, you often know that they have very complicated things going on the outside. They rarely come to their primary care physician to talk about the mental health of their kids, for instance, or that their marriage isn't doing well, or that they're struggling at the workplace. But you could just see in their kind of challenge in doing the self-care needed, particularly for chronic illness, diabetes, hypertension, and so on, that they were not fully engaged in their self-care. They wouldn't always keep appointments. They wouldn't take their medications on time and so on. And I got very interested in what are the things that removed people from doing the best job they could of being their own caretaker in a way. And so that led me down the path of trying to explore through mindfulness and other strategies how to invite people to be fully in touch with themselves, and often with some very positive results. But it wasn't really until the trauma of 9/11 and some other bigger issues, and then certainly we saw it again with COVID, that I saw how prevalent loneliness is. It's not just a handful of people. I think, as I've said, we're all lonely from time to time, and almost 50% of people have serious loneliness experiences that really get in their way of them being as healthy and well as they could be. And that's really what ultimately pushed me to write the book and do a lot of the work we're doing to demystify loneliness and give people the insights that'll help them best navigate it.
I appreciate that.
Sure. My pleasure to have these conversations and, kind of giving people the tools, the insights, and the courage they need to be their best selves is really the only way we're going to move forward as a community, as a society, to go in the direction we need to go.
And it's so vital now that we are working remotely so much more, and that there's so many reasons for us to not meet in person, but that doesn't mean that we can't have connection virtually, as we were saying before. So I think it might be more challenging for some of us, but we need to get even more creative in how we create connection.
That's right. Be creative in how we create connection and find those opportunities. Take that extra 30 seconds, 60 seconds after a Zoom call or before a Zoom call to say, hey, hey, what's lighting you up these days, right? And not just get right into the business agenda of the call.
Yeah. Yeah. So appreciate that. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you for the work that you do. As we close, I'd love to, I know you have an important event coming up that you'd like to invite our listeners to join. So you want to mention that?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So Project Unlonely, our signature initiative, has programs of various types. We do three things. We try to increase awareness of loneliness and its health risks, reduce the stigma around it, and then make arts-enabled programs available through community organizations, faith-based groups, schools, libraries, places of worship, so people can have the experience of connecting with the arts and develop the skills, the confidence, and the motivation to do it. But if you come back to what we do for awareness and stigma reduction, for the last 7 years, we've been doing that by making short films that talk about loneliness from one perspective or another, aging, illness, modernity, trauma, all the kind of things that invite loneliness spirals. And these short films are narrative films, animations, documentaries, but what they have in common is they unpack loneliness in a very human way. So we encourage people to watch the films with other people in group settings or even on their own and get energized about what's possible to connect. So we call this Project Unlovely Films. We're now in season 7. We launch season 8 with a big announcement that the wonderful actor and director Steve Buscemi has joined us as an ambassador for Project Unlovely Films. He'll be helping to kick off season 8 launch, on June 2nd, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. It's going to stream nationally, no charge. Come join us, leave comments in the chart, interact with us, and get introduced to this really wonderful resource that we make available broadly so that we can watch these films, be in touch with ourselves, with others, and be more connected. Come join us, please.
And we will be sure to put a link to that in the show notes. So wonderful. I'm looking forward to joining that. Thank you. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you for your work. Thank you to Cindy Elkins for giving me your book and introducing me to you. It's important work, and I have so much appreciation for it. So thank you, Dr. Nobel.
Well, and Suzanne, thank you for giving me this opportunity. I think you're so aware of some of the complexities of navigating these difficult topics. I think this may be one of the most comfortable engagements, with sometimes difficult things I've experienced. I'm particularly grateful for that. And I hope it's helpful for all who have a chance to listen to it.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you so much. With gratitude. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Stay courageous. The Courage Effect is brought to you by Weller Collaboration. We partner with individuals, teams, and organizations to enhance leadership, increase agility, and build effective teams. More information about us is available via the links in our show notes. Please spread the word about the Courage Effect. Rate and review your favorite episodes on iTunes or your favorite podcast platform. Share with your colleagues, family, and anyone in your universe who might be inspired by a good dose of courage. If you have feedback or stories to share about the show or would like to apply to be a guest, please contact us via our website. Benny Mathers is our producer. Dave Nelson composed our theme music. Alex Sandyforth is our administrative maven, and I'm your host, Suzanne Weller.